When we talk about the construction of the United States as a world power, we often hear words like freedom, democracy, and hard work. But there is a much simpler, and at the same time brutal element that stitched this nation together from its very origins. Cotton. Small, light, soft to the touch, but behind every white fiber there was blood, pain, and an economic system that placed profit above human dignity. At the end of the 18th century, few could have imagined that a fragile plant, sensitive to moisture and soil, would become the foundation of an empire. And this empire was not built with bricks. It was woven with white threads, sewn with iron chains, and sustained by blackbacks bent under the scorching southern sun. At the beginning of the American Republic, cotton was still a low-scale product. Tobacco, rice, and indigo plantations dominated the agricultural landscape of the South. But everything began to change with the Industrial Revolution in Europe, especially in England. The explosion of the textile industry turned cotton into an essential commodity, and the eyes of the world turned to the United States. The southern climate was ideal for cultivation. The vast stretches of available land, combined with enslaved labor, created the perfect environment for the growth of a new economy. It was on this fertile soil, watered with sweat and maintained with violence, that the cotton empire began to flourish. With the expansion of demand for cotton textiles in Europe, especially in Great Britain, the United States quickly became the world's largest exporter of the fiber. In just a few years, the country shifted from a fragmented agrarian economy to an agricultural powerhouse focused on exports. Port cities like Charleston, New Orleans, and Savannah thrived. Banks, insurance companies, shipping firms all profited from the cotton industry. And while the northern urban centers grew rich from commerce and industrialization, the South became increasingly dependent on the intensive cultivation of cotton and, consequently, the slavery that sustained it. But this accelerated growth was not a spontaneous miracle. It was meticulously engineered. Large landowners realized that cotton was the key to their social and political ascent. They invested in fertile lands, expanded their estates, bought more enslaved people, and became the barons of the South. Cotton was not just a commodity, it was a currency of power. It was the fuel that powered the country's economic engine, and at the same time, it was the shackle that kept millions chained to the condition of human merchandise. The numbers are staggering. Between 1820 and 1860, cotton production in the United States jumped from 500,000 to over 4 million bales per year. And with that increase came more brutality. Every new field planted required more arms, more bodies, more suffering. The logic was simple and cruel. The more you harvested, the more you earned. And the more you earned, the more you planted. A hellish cycle of profit and oppression that turned the South into a true machine for grinding human lives. Meanwhile, in the North, textile factories thrived. The web was national. The South produced, the North processed, and together they profited. At the expense of an enslaved people, it was the birth of a deeply unequal capitalist model, where capital concentrated at one end and suffering spread like invisible roots beneath the earth. And all of this with the complicity of the state. Laws were created to protect the property of slaveholders. Politicians allied themselves with the interests of the rural elite. The Constitution of the United States, in its early form, recognized and legitimized slavery. The Cotton Empire was not a shadow outside the system. It was the system itself. It's important to remember that this machinery was not limited to fields and ports. It penetrated culture, religion, education. Preachers justified slavery with biblical passages. Schools taught that black people were inferior. Newspapers defended the superiority of the white race. Cotton financed not only clothes, but ideologies. Not just ships, but narratives. And thus, the white fiber also became a curtain that hid the truth. That the wealth of one nation was being built upon the ruin of another. But not everyone stayed silent. Even if in the minority voices were raised. Intellectuals, abolitionists, foreign travelers wrote with indignation about what they saw in the southern fields. But the cotton machine was powerful, and any threat to it was seen as a threat to the very existence of the United States, because cotton was not just a product, it was the symbol of an economy believed to be invincible, a system where every fiber picked represented a suffocated life. The most paradoxical part is that even with all this dependence, the cotton empire was built on an unstable foundation. Any fluctuation in international prices, any diplomatic crisis, any internal rebellion, and the whole structure trembled. It was a house of cards made of soft fabrics and iron chains, and like every empire that grows too big, it carried within it the seed of its own downfall. From here, we need to understand how this frenzied expansion found its definitive gear, a simple invention, almost innocent at first glance, but one that forever changed the course of American history. A machine that promised to ease labor, but ended up multiplying the pain. In the next chapter, we'll meet Eli Whitney and the contraption that accelerated the engine of slavery. American history is filled with inventors who changed the nation's course, but few had an impact as deep, and at the same time as contradictory, as Eli Whitney. When he introduced his device to the world in 1793, what was expected was progress. What occurred was the opposite. His invention, the cotton gin, promised to revolutionize the agricultural industry. And indeed it did. But not by liberating arms, it bound them even tighter. Until then, separating cotton seeds from their fibers was a manual, slow, and exhausting task. One enslaved person could spend hours cleaning a single kilogram of cotton. It was arduous, grueling work that limited production. Whitney's invention, by automating this process, multiplied productivity dozens of times over. Suddenly, tons of cotton could be processed per day. For many, it was the miracle of efficiency. But for the black bodies in the fields, it marked the beginning of an even more brutal era. Capitalist logic responded instantly. If cotton had once been limited by the slowness of processing, now that obstacle had disappeared. The great landowners saw an opportunity: plant more, harvest more, grow richer. But for that, they needed more hands. Or rather, more enslaved people. The demand for labor exploded. The internal trafficking of enslaved individuals grew like never before. Families were torn apart, children ripped from their mothers' arms, husbands sold far from their wives. And all of it was done to feed the gears of the new machine. What began as a mechanical invention became a social mechanism of oppression. The cotton gin freed no one. On the contrary, it deepened the system of slavery. It fueled the expansion of plantations, consolidated the power of landowners, and accelerated the concentration of wealth. The American South became a landscape marked by endless rows of cotton, harvested under the scorching sun by men, women, and children chained by law and violence. Ironically, Eli Whitney never became wealthy from his invention. His patent rights were violated for years, and he died without enjoying the profits his machine had generated. But the true beneficiaries were the southern land barons, who skillfully used the contraption as a silent weapon. Slavery, which many had believed to be in decline by the end of the 18th century, was reborn with full force, driven by a machine of iron and gears, powered by human blood. The statistics do not lie. Before the invention of the cotton gin, the United States produced about 300,000 pounds of cotton per year. 3 decades later, that number exceeded 80 million, and along with it, the number of enslaved people rose dramatically. Between 1800 and 1860, the enslaved population jumped from just over 800,000 to nearly 4 million. The math was simple. More cotton required more bodies, and more bodies meant more suffering. This expansion was not only economic, it was political and ideological. The South, enriched by cotton and empowered by enslaved labor, began to see itself as independent, superior, almost a nation of its own. The notion of manifest destiny emerged, a belief that the United States had a divine mission to expand, even if it meant massacring indigenous peoples, annexing territories, and preserving slavery as a pillar of national identity. And at the center of that project was cotton, and behind it, Whitney's invention. Yet history is rarely told this way. In textbooks, the cotton gin appears as a symbol of progress. Little is mentioned about its role in reviving slavery. Even less is said about how it widened the racial chasm that still marks the United States today. It is more comfortable to celebrate technology than to face its perverse effects. Easier to praise the inventor's ingenuity than to hear the cries of those crushed by his creation. The cotton gin should have been a step toward freedom. It could have reduced the need for forced labor. But greed transformed a useful machine into a weapon of economic war. A war against dignity, against humanity, against hope. And the saddest part is that this pattern would repeat itself many times throughout history. Inventions used not to ease suffering, but to intensify exploitation. Eli Whitney may have never imagined what his machine would cause, but history is not made of intentions alone. It is shaped by consequences. And in this case, the consequence was the brutal consolidation of a system that was already cruel, now made even more efficient. A perfected mechanism to turn flesh into profit, sweat into currency, lives into statistics. But for that system, as powerful as it was, something more was needed. A command base, a social structure to defend it, justify it, immortalize it. Because machines can accelerate production, but it is the men in power who decide how they are used. In the next chapter, we will meet the true kings of this empire, the cotton lords, who turned plantations into thrones and enslaved people into ladders to power. Eli Whitney's machine had accelerated the rhythm of production, but the real owners of power were far from the workshops. They lived in mansions surrounded by white columns, with wide porches, manicured gardens, and enslaved workers laboring day and night to maintain the immaculate facade. These men were not just farmers. They were politicians, bankers, newspaper owners, judges. They were the cotton lords, and they had turned their plantations into private kingdoms where laws were shaped according to their profits. With cotton in one hand and a whip in the other, they built thrones on the pain of others. The American South between the 18th and 19th centuries became a land of rural empires. Plantations grew like cities. Some exceeded 5,000 acres, with hundreds of enslaved people living in wooden shacks, without rights, without names, without a future. And at the top of this brutal hierarchy stood the cotton barons, white men who saw themselves as an American aristocracy, heirs of European blood, superior by birth and by property. They didn't just control the economy, they controlled the region's imagination. These lords defined the South's social standards. Their sons went to the best schools. Their daughters were prepared to marry other heirs of land and slaves. Their marriages weren't just romantic unions, they were political alliances. And meanwhile, their enslaved workers were traded like cattle, transported in chains, and punished with methodical cruelty. The power of these men did not come solely from cotton itself, but from the system they helped create, a culture of submission, silence, and fear. And like every empire, theirs needed an ideology to sustain it. Thus was born the doctrine of Southern supremacy, a belief reinforced by preachers, writers, and politicians, claiming that the natural order of the world was one where white people ruled and black people obeyed. Slavery, under this twisted logic, was a good, a civilizing tool. Many claimed that black people were blessed for being brought from Africa to work under the care of Christian whites. This sick narrative was not marginal, it was dominant. In this context, cotton became a symbol of glory. In southern newspapers, the lords were exalted as heroes of progress. In churches, they were praised as men of faith and honor. At social events, they were treated as modern princes, and all of it rested upon absolute exploitation. Every bale of cotton shipped to the ports carried invisibly the weight of the backs that had picked it. Every luxury dress produced in England began its journey in the sweat of someone chained on a plantation in Alabama or Mississippi. The Southern cotton elite also controlled politics. They held seats in Congress, elected presidents, and influenced national decisions. They were masters of legal manipulation to preserve their privileges. The American Constitution, property rights, treaties with foreign nations, everything was tailored to protect their fields and profits. When threatened, they did not hesitate to react with violence or political blackmail. The power of the cotton lords was both regional and national, and the wealth was obscene. Many of these lords were richer than European nobles. They traveled with entourages, hosted lavish balls, imported furniture from France, dined with silver utensils, and owned private libraries. But that sophistication was a thin shell hiding daily brutality. While they danced waltzes in chandelier-lit halls, their properties echoed with muffled screams, nighttime beatings, and exemplary punishments. The opulence of a few was born from the calculated misery of many. The women in these families were also part of the machine. Some were horrified by what they saw, but most accepted and perpetuated the slave-holding logic. They oversaw domestic work, administered punishments, decided who would be sold, who would be separated from their family. Even within what was considered the female sphere, there was domination and violence. On many plantations, children born from the systematic rape of enslaved women were raised as servants, without their true origins ever being acknowledged. The Cotton Empire had roots so deep that they invaded people's intimacy and identity, and there was also a culture of silence. Enslaved people were forbidden from learning to read or write. Communication among them was monitored. Artistic expression was limited to what pleased the masters. Yet even so, songs, chants, symbols, and African traditions endured. The throne of the cotton lords was solid, but the ground beneath their feet was always restless. They knew that it would take only a single spark to turn that cotton field into a battlefield. Even so, they kept investing, cultivating, exporting. At the peak of the Cotton Empire, the United States supplied about 70% of the cotton consumed in Europe. The phrase, "cotton is king," became popular, not as a metaphor, but as a fact. And the kings in that scenario were men who ruled plantations like nations, men who saw themselves as gods on earth, deciding who lived, who died, who was bought, who was forgotten. But every monarchy carries within it the seed of resistance. Every oppression, sooner or later, reaches its limit. And in the Cotton Empire, that limit would come with the accumulation of political tensions, silenced revolts, and a country divided between profit and morality. The Southern lords still believed in the eternity of their reign, but in the distance the sound of footsteps grew louder. Footsteps of men and women who would no longer accept being treated as tools. Footsteps of soldiers, abolitionists, and nations in conflict. Cotton was king, but no throne lasts forever. By then, cotton had already become the backbone of the American economy. But for that empire to thrive, it needed more than fertile land and favorable climate. It needed bodies, black bodies, sweaty, beaten, controlled. Except these bodies were no longer just workers. They had been fully converted into capital, literally. The enslaved body became currency, loan collateral, banking asset, and inheritable property. The slave-holding system didn't just use people, it priced them. Every enslaved man, woman, or child was financially assessed, not only for physical strength, but for age, health, skills, and even obedience. Documents of the time didn't use names. They used descriptions like young mulatto girl, good for domestic service, or strong black man, ideal for heavy harvesting. Banks, brokers, and notaries actively participated in these negotiations. A planter could walk into a bank, present his human assets as collateral, and obtain a loan to expand his plantation. It was the banking of the enslaved body. The practice was so common that in the accounting books of plantations and financial institutions, the names of enslaved people appeared alongside bales of cotton, oxen, and agricultural tools. There was no difference between a hoe and a 15-year-old black boy. Both were appraised, sold, traded, inherited, and repossessed. In case of bankruptcy, the bank could foreclose the debt and auction off enslaved people as part of the estate liquidation. And this didn't happen in silence. It was public, legal, legitimized. Cities grew around these auctions. In New Orleans, for example, slave markets moved millions. There, entire families were separated in a matter of minutes. Auctioneers stood on wooden crates, enthusiastically describing the products, and buyers decided with a nod who was worth more, who would be discarded. The atmosphere was that of a fair. Crying children, wives trying to say goodbye, men tied like cattle. All of it in broad daylight, under applause or indifference. These practices didn't occur only in the Deep South. Northern banks, universities, and insurance companies all profited from this system. Many of the largest American financial institutions were founded on this kind of credit. Insurance companies offered policies on enslaved bodies. If an enslaved person died, the owner received compensation. There was no illusion of humanity in this model. It was a cold, mathematical logic of total transformation of the human being into merchandise. It was the peak of dehumanization, and it produced a devastating psychological effect. For the enslaved, identity loss was daily. It wasn't enough to work from sunup to sundown. One had to accept that their very body no longer belonged to them, that their children could be sold at any moment, that their value was tied to productivity and submission. The pain wasn't just physical. It was existential. Living without a name, without a past, without guarantees. Breathing in fear, eating in haste, sleeping with one eye open, and always, always knowing there was a price on your head. Meanwhile, profits exploded. It's estimated that at the height of the Cotton Empire, the total value of enslaved people in the United States exceeded the combined value of all industries, railroads, and real estate in the country. It was the greatest concentration of human wealth ever recorded in American history, an entire market sustained by flesh, blood, and bones. Black bodies were the hidden engine that kept the national machine turning, invisible during celebrations, but essential to the financial balance. And even so, many refused to see the perversion of the system. The excuse of the time was clear. It's legal. The law protected property rights, and that included people. Courts defended the owners. The Constitution maintained loopholes. The Bible was twisted from pulpits. Morality was shaped according to economic interest. Slavery, in the eyes of the elite, was merely a detail of the civilizing process, a necessary sacrifice for progress. And anyone who dared to disagree was called an agitator, a radical, an enemy of order. But the truth is, this system was never just economic. It was psychological, political, spiritual. Turning a human being into capital is the height of arrogance. It's the gesture of an empire that sees itself as eternal. But even the strongest systems begin to crack when the voices of silence become unbearable, when numbers can no longer hide the stories, and when profit begins to smell like corpses. While the fields of the American South swarmed with black arms harvesting cotton under white orders, across the ocean, Europe exhaled progress. In London, Paris, Liverpool, and Manchester, the bourgeoisie displayed fine clothes, white sheets, elegant curtains. Shop windows sparkled, the fabrics were light, soft, affordable. But there was something missing from the labels. Every stitched thread carried the mark of an empire built with American blood and European money. Cotton crossed the Atlantic like white gold, and Europe, with its glowing salons and smoky factories, was an essential part of the mechanism. The United Kingdom was the largest buyer of American cotton during much of the 19th century. The city of Manchester, for instance, was nicknamed Cottonopolis, the cotton metropolis. Thousands of tons arrived at the port of Liverpool, were unloaded by labourers and sent to the factories of northern England. These factories operated day and night, fueling the Industrial Revolution with raw material picked by enslaved hands. It was the perfect marriage between rural American slavery and urban European capitalism. Two distant worlds united by an invisible fabric. And it wasn't just the United Kingdom. France also benefited from southern cotton. Mills in Lyon, Marseille, and other cities processed the raw cotton, transforming it into refined products for export and domestic consumption. The French bourgeoisie, so fond of talking about liberté, égalité, fraternité, had no issue wearing fabrics born from suffering. The hypocrisy was transatlantic. In exchange for elegance and comfort, Europeans stayed silent in the face of chains. After all, cotton was cheap, abundant, and didn't leave visible stains. European banks, in turn, financed this system with pride. They offered credit to merchants, insured maritime transport, and participated in export companies. In many business letters of the time, the terms were clear: cotton from producing states, shipment according to slave harvest. There was no secrecy. It was public, and no one cared as long as the profit was guaranteed. The gears turned without guilt. Europe fed on American slavery with voracious appetite. Every new palace, every art gallery, every noble banquet contained its share of cotton. And even the European abolitionist movements, however sincere some sectors may have been, often clashed with economic interests too deep to challenge. How could they condemn slavery without compromising profits? How could they criticize the United States without hurting their own industries? Cotton silently became a moral currency. The more it was consumed, the less it could be questioned. The trade routes formed a true global web. Cotton left the American South, headed to northern ports, crossed the Atlantic, supplied European factories, which in turn sold textiles to Africa, Asia, and Latin America. It was a closed cycle, a system where everyone profited, except those who actually worked. The enslaved saw no money, no freedom, no recognition. They were parts. And the more the wheel turned, the more bodies were crushed. Even countries that had officially abolished slavery remained dependent on American cotton. It was a selective, blind, convenient abolition. We no longer enslave, they said, but they bought, invested, traded as if nothing had changed. Slavery was exported along with the merchandise. It became invisible to the eye, but present in the seams. It was the kind of complicity that doesn't get written in books, but is always present in the profit margins. There was another silent factor in this equation: aesthetics. Cotton made fashion democratic. Lighter clothes, cheaper fabrics, refined patterns. Suddenly the middle class could dress like the elite. Beauty was sold as progress. But that advancement, to be possible, demanded a cruel regression elsewhere in the world. Every new dress in Paris, every sheet sold in London, was sustained by whippings delivered in Alabama, Georgia, Mississippi. It was a system that manufactured luxury with pain. Europe was not just complicit, it was an active part of the engine. It fed on slavery with economic hunger and masked its appetite with enlightened discourse. While publishing treaties on liberty and civilization, it profited from the systematic denial of millions' humanity. It was a banquet where the enslaved were never invited, but without whom nothing could be served. But not all cotton came from the plantations. A part of it, more subtle, was cultivated in the hearts of those who refused to see. The cotton of indifference, soft to the touch, comfortable to wear, but deeply corrosive. It was this cotton that muffled consciences, covered truths, and disguised barbarity beneath elegant smiles. And it was this cotton that kept the system running. While bankers counted profits and lords harvested cotton, behind the scenes of the empire, a silent force pulsed. It didn't come from cannons or palaces, but from hearts that insisted on remaining human, even when everything tried to reduce them to numbers. Because, though treated as statistics, the enslaved were never just figures. They were people, with memory, faith, longing, dreams. And it was through these invisible forces that resistance began to bloom. Not in open field battles, but in small gestures, in everyday acts, in silences filled with meaning. The first form of resistance was survival itself. Living day after day, knowing you could be sold, punished, or killed, was an act of courage. Staying alive in a system that profited from your pain was a political act. The masters believed they controlled everything, but they couldn't control the intimate. And there, in secrecy, the enslaved built fortresses. They sang while they worked, and each song was a code, a warning, a hope, a prayer. It was music, but it was also escape. Yes, escape. Many risked their lives to try to reach freedom. Alone or in groups, with improvised maps or guided only by the stars, men and women crossed forests, rivers and swamps. Some made it, and some were captured, branded, beaten. But each attempt challenged the system. Every step outside the plantation was a cry against the imposed fate, and for every failed escape, many others were prepared in secret. Resistance was an underground river, impossible to dam forever. Others resisted by staying, but without surrendering. They sabotaged tools, moved slowly, planted more than ordered to feed their own, hid the sick, wrote messages with symbols, pretended not to understand commands, cared for one another with tenderness and hope. The solidarity among the enslaved was an invisible shield. When one was punished, the others shared the pain. When a child was born, everyone celebrated as if it were a seed of the future. To resist was also to love. And then there were the women, so often forgotten by the books, but essential in the trenches of daily life. They cooked, gave birth, cared, soothed, taught, protected. Some led escapes, others hid weapons. Many faced the sexual violence of the masters alone and still stood tall. Women who held their families with wounded hands, who sang African lullabies by the fire, who passed on culture, faith, and resistance through their gaze. With each gesture, they defied the project of annihilation that tried to erase them from history. Religion was also both shelter and weapon. While the masters used Bible verses to justify slavery, the enslaved found in the scriptures the opposite: liberation. Moses, the Hebrews, the Exodus, the cry in the desert. These stories became living metaphors. Night gatherings held in secret behind the quarters were acts of worship and resistance. There they wept, but also dreamed. There they feared, but also believed. Faith was the last free territory, and no one could take it away. There were also revolts. Yes, they happened. Even though silenced by official accounts, uprisings occurred in several regions. Planters were killed, crops were burned, militias were formed to resist. Some revolts were led by spiritual leaders, others by young people tired of the yoke. Many failed, some left trails of blood. But all were expressions of the same desire: to no longer be an object, to be human, to be free. The slave-holding system wanted to turn slavery into routine, into normality. But it never managed to completely extinguish the fire of insubordination. The eyes of the enslaved were not submissive, they were watchful. They observed everything, calculated risks, waited for chances. Freedom was a constant rumor. And even if it took long to arrive, it was passed from mouth to mouth like a sacred secret. No chain could suffocate the desire to exist with dignity. And this is where we must look more closely. The Cotton Empire was not invincible. It was held together by force, violence, and collective omission, but inside it was already trembling, because when a system is built on total repression, every human gesture becomes a threat. A hug, a song, a memory, everything becomes dangerous. The lords knew this, and that's why they invested so much in control, because they feared what they couldn't dominate, the soul. What the elites never understood is that you can't erase an entire humanity with statistics. You can't silence millions with the whip. Resistance may be invisible for a time, but it grows, like a root, like a scar, like a prophecy. And that's what was spreading through the fields, the certainty that the empire that clothed the world in cotton would not be able to strip a people of their dignity forever. The Cotton Empire seemed unshakable. Wealthy plantations, crowded ports, confident banks, Europe buying non-stop, but every structure built on injustice silently carries cracks that grow with time. In the United States, those cracks began to split wide open in the 19th century. The country, divided between the industrial North and the agricultural, slave-holding South, could no longer maintain the illusion of a harmonious union. And at the center of that abyss was not just slavery, but the cotton that fed it. The South wanted to preserve its lifestyle, its wealth, its supremacy, and for that, it needed slavery as its foundation. The North, pressured by abolitionist sectors and industrial growth, saw the expansion of slavery as an economic and moral threat. Every new state joining the Union sparked heated debate. Would it be a free or slave-holding state? The tension spread like dry fire across the fields, and the fuse was fully lit in 1861. With the election of Abraham Lincoln, who opposed the expansion of slavery, the South saw its power threatened. 11 states broke from the Union and formed the Confederate States of America. The official reason, autonomy. The real reason, to preserve slavery, and with it, cotton. The war that followed wasn't just about territory. It was a war for the future of millions, a war to decide whether the country would keep profiting from pain or finally confront its own conscience. During the years of conflict, the cotton fields became battlegrounds. Many plantations were abandoned, others were taken by the army. Enslaved people fled en masse, seeking refuge among Union troops. Some even enlisted and fought for a freedom that had not yet been officially granted to them. It was cotton being torn from the hands of the masters by force. It was the system beginning to collapse. But the Confederates did not give up easily. They used cotton as a diplomatic weapon. They believed that the United Kingdom and France, dependent on the raw material, would intervene on their behalf. This strategy became known as cotton diplomacy. But the Europeans, cautious, chose not to get directly involved, and the South was left isolated. King Cotton, as they called it, was ignored at the decisive moment. The throne began to shake. In 1863, Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation, declaring the enslaved people in the rebellious states free. The document did not immediately free everyone, but it changed the meaning of the war. Now, the conflict was not just about preserving the Union, it was also about freedom. It was a direct blow to the heart of the Cotton Empire. Plantations saw their laborers disappear. The barons saw their businesses crumble. The system did not collapse out of compassion, it collapsed by force. When the war ended in 1865, the United States was in ruins. More than 600,000 people had died. The South was devastated, and officially, slavery was abolished through the 13th Amendment to the Constitution. But the end of legal slavery did not mean the end of exploitation. Many freedmen remained in the same fields, now as free workers, but without land, without education, without protection. Cotton still needed to be harvested, and the system found new ways to keep their backs bent. In the following decades, segregation laws emerged, along with abusive labor contracts and armed militias, to intimidate freed black people. What was once done with chains was now done with bureaucracy. The cotton empire was not destroyed. It was recycled. It adapted. It changed its appearance, but the basement remained dark. The promised freedom arrived with limits, and the dream of national reconstruction was never fully realized for those who had been enslaved. Even so, something had changed forever. The sound of chains no longer echoed with the same power. The stories of escapes, songs, and struggle were now whispered with pride. The flame of dignity, which had never gone out, now burned publicly. Men and women who had once been silenced began to write, sing, and speak out. Cotton still clothed the world, but now the world was beginning to hear where it came from. The empire fell, but its ruins remained. And it is upon those ruins that modern America was built, with open wounds, buried memories, and truths still not fully spoken. The Civil War was indeed a turning point, but it was also a shattered mirror, reflecting to this day the contradictions of a country that grew by saying liberty for all, while profiting from the enslavement of millions. The official end of slavery in the United States marked a new era, but it did not dismantle the system that sustained it. Cotton continued to be planted, harvested, transported, and sold. The economy did not stop. The names of the practices changed, but the faces of the exploited remained the same. The cotton empire, though shaken, survived in disguise, and as the world evolved, it quietly spread to other territories, assuming new forms of servitude. Modern slavery emerged in the heart of the 21st century, and cotton is still at the center of that story. Today, cotton is found in almost everything: clothes, towels, sheets, filters, cosmetics. It is one of the most consumed agricultural products on the planet, and it remains wrapped in paradoxes. In many producing countries, such as Uzbekistan, India, Pakistan, and parts of Africa, millions of workers still face conditions akin to slavery. Children labor in vast fields under extreme heat. Women are forced to meet impossible quotas. Indebted farmers are coerced into giving up their labor without fair pay. All so that, on the other side of the world, consumers can find cheap t-shirts in store windows. Human rights organizations report, year after year, cases of forced labor, human trafficking, document confiscation, and physical abuse in cotton production chains. And most shocking, many of these plantations supply major global brands that outsource responsibility and hide violations under layers of bureaucracy. Cotton still generates billions, but those who pick it remain invisible. The old logic re-emerges. The profits are white, the bodies are dark. In the United States, the fields have changed, but the remnants of exploitation remain alive. The regions where slavery was most intense are still, to this day, among the poorest, most unequal, and most racially segregated. Many direct descendants of enslaved people still live in marginalized communities, with limited access to education, healthcare, employment, and justice. Cotton, a symbol of wealth for a few, left a trail of structural poverty for many. It is the unresolved legacy of an empire that was never fully confronted. Beyond economic exploitation, there is symbolic exploitation. Fashion, for example, still celebrates Southern style, with floral fabrics and picturesque plantations in advertising campaigns, ignoring what those places truly represented. The romanticism of the slaveholding South still appears in films, music, and festivals. Meanwhile, stories of resistance, pain, and survival are silenced or forgotten. The memory of slavery is constantly pushed to the backstage, as if it were an inconvenient detail in a glorious story. But there are movements that challenge this erasure. Artists, intellectuals, activists, and educators have been raising up those forgotten voices. Documentaries, exhibitions, books, and community initiatives are rescuing the names, faces, and paths of those erased by official history. Memory, when nurtured, becomes strength. And today, more than ever, there is a generation willing to look back, not out of nostalgia, but for justice. Awareness around consumption is also growing. More people are asking, who made my clothes? And demanding transparency from brands. Fair trade labels, origin tracking, and boycotts of companies involved in forced labor are modern forms of resistance. Consumption, when conscious, becomes a political act. And cotton, when traced, reveals much more than style. It reveals ethics. Still, the challenge is enormous. Modern slavery is silent, fragmented, and legally protected by the gray zones of the global market. The victims often don't even realize they're being exploited, and consumers often prefer not to know. It's easier to wear a shirt than to confront the history stitched into it. Comfort still depends, in many cases, on someone else's discomfort. Cotton remains white, but the hands that cultivate it still bleed. We must remember that systems of oppression do not disappear on their own. They reinvent themselves. And if today we no longer have iron chains, we have exploitative contracts. If there are no public auctions, there are algorithms that assign value to lives. The language has changed, the setting has changed, but the logic of exploitation, that unfortunately is still alive. The Cotton Empire is not just a page in history. It is a mirror, and it still reflects our choices, our habits, and our silences. Cotton seems light, white, soft, but throughout history it has carried more weight than any precious metal. It has clothed kings, built empires, funded wars, and silenced millions. It wasn't just a fiber, it was an invisible chain that stitched the world together at the cost of black lives, buried beneath the promise of progress. And the cruelest part is that for centuries, many people wore that history without ever noticing the blood in the seams. Today, cotton is in our homes, in our clothes, in our daily routines. But it's also in the books we never read, in the lessons we were never taught, in the names that were erased. It is a symbol of a past that refuses to fade, and we can only transform it when we choose to face the truth. Without romanticism, without censorship, without fear. Because there is no reparation without memory. There is no dignified future without the courage to revisit what has been denied. The question that remains is, what will you do with the knowledge you now carry? Ignore it, minimize it, or turn it into action? You can start by sharing this story. You can examine your consumer choices. You can talk about this with your family. You can pressure brands and governments. But above all, you can refuse to stay silent. If this video moved you, subscribe to the channel, hit the notification bell, and share it with someone who needs to know this truth. Here, we don't hide the pain. We honor those who resisted. Because telling these stories is also an act of justice. And justice, like cotton, begins with a seed that, when cultivated with awareness, can blossom into freedom.